This is the Bamel Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today we are diving into the story of the Passover and its plagues, God's interaction with Pharaoh, and the call of God's rescued people.
Yeah, man, I love this conversation. Still do. Loved it back then. Loved it the first time around. Love it this time around. It's just a good conversation.
Seems to be an evolving conversation for us, for foremen, for all sorts of people.
Yeah, and I remember the first time we did this episode in the first round, I was really worried it was going to be like an hour and a half long. It ended up only being 30 minutes. So we didn't do any review back then. And I don't have a lot of faith in myself now. The more evolved version of me seems to be longer winded. So I think I'm going to dive right in today.
All right.
When I first encountered this teaching, it was a long, long time ago. It was before Rabbi Foreman had Aleph Beta. And he was lecturing at the Hofberger Institute. And I remember one of the ways that I engaged this teaching was Foreman had done, like originally, he had all these short little videos on YouTube. And I don't, like this was years ago. I don't even remember what YouTube was capable of doing back then. I don't know if they had playlists back then. I don't even know. All I know is that Foreman had not arranged it in a playlist. And I believe there were 22 parts of this teaching on YouTube. And it was just kind of Foreman sitting against like a digital backdrop. And man, were they they were 10 minutes or less, these little sections. And they were all mixed up and based on your algorithm, like you had to go hunting for like video number 7. You had to find video number 8. You had to make sure you were watching the right video. And it was a treasure hunt just to get through the whole series. But it was like just this stunning journey through the story of Pharaoh and the hardening of his heart. And then I'm pretty sure those got taken off of YouTube. And I was like, oh no. And I couldn't find the teaching anymore. And I was so angry that it had disappeared. And then I realized why it had probably disappeared. And that's because it became a book, which is, Brent, we recommend this book multiple times. And I probably get more comments about this book than maybe it's in the top 5 of the books that we've recommended, that when I travel around, people are like, oh my goodness, I got this book. The Exodus You Almost Passed Over by Rabbi David Foreman. The Exodus, which is a clever title, if I do say so myself. Don't you think, Brent?
I mean, it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Foreman's always so clever with his titles. The Exodus You Almost Passed Over. But it became this great, and it's by far the best way that he had packaged the material up to that point. And just absolutely love that book. So can't recommend that book enough. I'm going to attempt to summarize some of the teachings there, do it in a way that's not just blatantly plagiarizing his material, and not dive too deep in, because really, ultimately, you got to get his book and you got to read it for yourself and do the deep dive as you would. But that's the source. If you want to do a deeper dive, that's the source.
Beautiful.
Foreman's going to do what he often does. When Foreman is at, like, when he's peak Rabbi David Foreman, his teachings always begin with like a list of questions that just keep building one on another. And I'm not talking about 3 or 4 questions. I'm talking like 10 to 20 questions. And the Western mind is like, if you don't start answering these questions, I am going to freak out, because you just keep building question on top of question on top of question. And this is typical for like my favorite teachings of Foreman always do this. They'd be these long lectures that just start with 20 minutes of questions. And then all of a sudden, Foreman starts working his way slowly, often in reverse, kind of back through his list of questions. And he just starts tying the questions, just one to another. Ting, da-ting, da-ting, da-ting. And by the time you're done, you're like, whoa, it's just this beautiful way of teaching. And that's what Foreman does in this conversation. That's what he always has done in this teaching. He starts with a list of questions. Let me think about the Passover today. So think about the Exodus story. Think about my mind automatically has scenes of the Prince of Egypt flashing through my mind.
You got to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think about the story of the Passover, and Foreman starts asking these questions. He says, number 1, of all the things that you could name it, why have we named it Passover? Like, why not Freedom Day? Like, isn't the story about the liberation of the Israelites? Why is because the Passover is just one of how many plagues, Brent?
1 of 10.
1 of 10. And it's the culmination, like it's the final. But why name it after that plague? That feels like a weird choice. Like if you're going to name your holiday, it's actually not about that plague. It's about the larger idea that plague facilitates. Why name the day after the plague? Why not call it Independence Day? Why not? Like there's so many other things we could call it. So that's question number 1.
That's kind of how I feel about a lot of old hymns and other songs where they just name the song based on the first line of the song. I was like, that doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what the song is about in most cases.
That's such a great tie. Good parallel. I love that. Yeah. Foreman says, why would we do that? What's going on with that? Second question, Foreman says, why is the firstborn so important to this story? I don't know if you remember all the way back in like episode 2 when we talked about Adam and Eve and we said there's this really awkward presence of the theme of nakedness in the story. Like it's just nakedness is like so awkwardly. The one thing we're told about them is that they're naked. When they eat of the tree, the one thing they see is that they're naked. The one thing they tell God is that they're naked. God asks about their nakedness. Like the whole thing is about nakedness in this weird, odd way. In the Passover, like the odd thing is like the firstborn. Like it's good. That 10th plague, the Passover plague, is going to be the plague of the firstborn. There's a whole conversation about, I mean, obviously the angel's going to pass over and you're not going to lose your first. So it's going to be Pharaoh's firstborn. It's going to be Egyptians' firstborns. It's going to be about protecting your firstborns. When you're reading that, you're in Exodus 11. You get to Exodus 12. And then all of a sudden, Exodus 13, there's like this break in the story. And you have a whole chapter about the laws of consecrating the firstborn. And you're like, what? Like what? Like, why did we just interrupt the whole story? Like, right at the cliffhanger, like this cliffhanger moment of what's going to happen. Like, here comes the 10th plague. Here comes the rescue. And then, like, we have a whole chapter about here's what you're going to do with firstborn. Here's what you're going to do with firstborn animals. Here's what you're going to do with firstborn sons. Like, what in the world?
Totally weird. Totally out of place.
Yeah, it just feels like an odd focus. Foreman points out Tefillin. Tefillin are these things that Orthodox Jews will wear. You'll see them in their prayer moments. They'll wear things called the talit and the prayer shawl, but then they also have what's called tefillin. And tefillin are these leather straps. I bet you could actually find something in the link in the show notes if you wanted to, Brent. Probably a Wikipedia article on the tefillin. And you have these leather straps that end up, when you wrap them around your arm, you end up having this little black box that's right on your bicep, like really close to your heart. And you have a black box on your forehead. There's a headband that you wear, and it has a black box. So you have all these leather straps and these 2 black boxes. And it's supposed to be in reference to Deuteronomy, where God says, write the laws of God on your heart and bind them to your foreheads. So they've quite literally tried to do that as literally as they can. That's tefillin. Now, Rabbi Foreman says what's intriguing is that the tefillin have these little black boxes. What's in the little black box? Well, inside the little black box is a parchment, a little parchment, and on it are 3 commandments. Now, Brent, can you remember how many commandments there are in Torah?
There are 10.
Well, those are
least, I guess. 613 laws. 613
is the number I'm shooting for. So you got but you're going to put 3. You got 613 to choose from. I don't know. Like what laws are you going to put in there? The first one makes sense. What would you guess, Brent? If you had to guess the first law you're going to put in the box,
love the Lord your God.
Perfect. Right. The Shema, right? Actually, technically for them, it would be the Shema. I guess maybe Hear, O Israel would be the very first command. Command number 1 is Shema. Hear, O Israel. And then the Ve'ahavta. Love the Lord your God. What you just referenced. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. So number 1 is Shema. Number 2 is what they call Ve'ahavta. And then the third command, like just think about it. What do you think? What do you think? If our listeners are there, like, what do they think? The third, you get to choose any of the commands. What are the commands? The third command you're going to put in the box is the command of the broken neck donkey, which is exactly what you were thinking.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah,
of course.
No, definitely.
That's what I was thinking. I knew they were going to choose the broken neck donkey. It's like the most like, what? And the broken neck donkey is a law. It's in Exodus 13, I believe. Where if you're going to consecrate all these firstborn animals, and there are some animals that you can't consecrate by giving to God because they're unclean. And so you can redeem them with money. You can buy them back. You can give God the money instead of the animal because you can't give God an unclean animal. Well, a donkey is an unclean animal. You can't give God a donkey. And so if you can't redeem it with money, you somehow have to consecrate the donkey to God. And so it says you go out into the wilderness and you essentially you can't sacrifice it. It's an unclean animal. So you break the neck of this donkey. It's not the preferred option, but it's, again, like it's the most obscure, like of all the 613 commands. That's a weird one to put in the black box. And Rabbi Foreman says, what in the world? What in the world? Rabbi Foreman says, speaking of firstborns, we've got the firstborn, the awkward presence of firstborn. We got the firstborn donkey and the teflon. Rabbi Foreman says, Israel's going to be called in the Exodus story. Eventually, they're going to be called God's firstborn, but they are not God's firstborn. Like Abraham was chosen. Like there's lots of other people that were created, lots of other nations that are in the story. Like the nation of Israel, the children of Abraham are certainly not God's firstborn. That feels weird. Then Foreman says, okay, I got another question. Foreman says, what if, now we're only like 3 questions in, Brent, and you're already like, okay, but I need some answers, right? Well, hold on. We got more questions. So Rabbi Foreman says, if you were in charge of the Passover, why would you take 10 plagues to accomplish this? Like, it feels kind of like almost sick. Like, why would God, like, if you're going to rescue your people, like, just rescue your people. Like, why drag this on and almost like torture the Egyptians or it just feels like why like 3 plagues, 2 plagues, 1 plague? Like, why are we doing 10 plagues? If at the end of this, you're just going to rescue your people with the plague of the firstborn, why all the other chaos? Why 10 plagues to do this? And then Foreman says, how about this question? When Moses finally gets to Pharaoh and he asks to let them go, Moses says, will you let us go for 3 days? Is that what your understanding of what God told Moses to ask for, Brent?
No, not so much.
We thought that God told Moses, like, go rescue my people from Egypt. So Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, hey, can you let us go for 3 days? Like, what is going on there?
A long weekend.
Yeah, exactly. Literally a holiday weekend. So what about that? Next question. By the way, notice we're doing the same thing. What Foreman has taught me and taught so many to do is to do what we try to teach us in Bema, which is let's engage the problems we can find in the text first. Like, let's just mess up the story by noticing all the problems that are existent in the story. That's what Foreman's doing. What are the problems? He says, by the way, who's hardening hearts? Is it God or is it Pharaoh? It's very confusing. Is it God hardening Pharaoh's heart? Is it Pharaoh hardening his own heart? Because that seems to matter. And that's a good Christian theological question. We've been arguing about that for centuries. So good old Calvinists and Arminians going back and forth about who's hardening whose heart. Even Christians been arguing about that question.
Sure.
Then we got Foreman says, how about this question? Why is Pharaoh like playing weird with time? Like, at some point Moses will show up and he'll say, like, and Pharaoh will say, hey, can you get the frogs out of here? And Moses is like, sure. Sure. Well, we'll get the frogs out of here. When do you want them gone? And we might talk about this as we go along, but your thought would be what, Brent? When would you want hey, can you get these frogs gone? What would you say is the timing?
Yesterday.
Yeah. Could you do it like immediately, please? Like you couldn't do this fast enough. And yet Pharaoh's response would be, how about tomorrow? How about tomorrow at noon? Then there's the livestock, and Pharaoh he doesn't seem to care about his livestock. Like, his livestock are the ones that are dying. He doesn't care about that. What he asks about is whether or not somebody else's livestock are alive. Are the Israelites' livestock alive? Like, Pharaoh seems to be very unconcerned with power. Like, he is not bothered by the power of these plagues. What seems to have his complete attention is this idea of precision. Precision. And so let's see here. I'm going to read a bit. I don't want to just read a whole chapter. I'm not going to, and but I also don't want to plagiarize Foreman at all. So I'm going to read just a bit from Rabbi Foreman. Chapter 4 is where I'm going to be starting. He's got a chapter called The Tale of Two Speeches.
And I'll just say, like, we come back to this book in session 6 when we're talking about Joseph. Like, this covers more than just the plagues and the actual Exodus. Like, this is covering a pretty good chunk of the whole story in Egypt, right?
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely, 110%. A good chunk. We're not going to read a whole bunch today, but we're going to read a little bit. Actually, while I say that, would you read Exodus 5, verse 1?
Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness."
All right. So there's that first statement. I'm going to read Foreman here. That's what Foreman says. Let's freeze the action right here and imagine that we can walk back in time and inhabit that moment. Pretend that you are Moses and you have just said these words to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is about to respond to this demand that you have made. And when he does, you will need to figure out what to say next. So listen carefully and plot your next move accordingly. Here is what Pharaoh says to you. Brent, give us 5, verse 2.
Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go."
Okay. This is Foreman. Foreman says, okay, Moses, your move. How are you going to respond to this? Pharaoh is being pretty direct here. There's not a lot of ambiguity in his position. He doesn't know your God. He's not interested in letting Israel go. End of story. So what are you going to say to him next? You would seem to have two options. The first is simply to accept Pharaoh's answer, throw up your hands, and go back to God for further instructions. That would make sense. I'm going to skip a little bit further down here. Foreman says this. Your second option is do the exact opposite. Instead of retreating, you could up the ante. Look, Pharaoh, you don't realize who you're provoking here. It's the master of the universe, and trust me, you don't want to make him angry. If you back down now and let your slaves go, I think you'll be able to work something out with this God. But if you don't, look, I don't know how much Egypt is going to be left after God is done with you. All right, Brent, give us chapter 5, verse 3.
Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now, let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword."
All right, I'm going to go back to Foreman here. Now, did Moses really think this would work? It's as if he's saying, Pharaoh, we're really scared of our God. Who knows what he might do to us if we don't take a long weekend to the desert to offer sacrifices to him? Please, can't we just go? You wouldn't want your loyal slaves to get hurt or anything. Did Moses really believe this had a chance of working? Why would Moses think that Pharaoh would react favorably to this? Pharaoh had already said he didn't know who God was. And of course, it doesn't work, Foreman says later. This second speech of Moses seems to backfire terribly. Pharaoh accuses Moses and Aaron of needlessly distracting his precious slaves from their work. A little bit later, Foreman says, Pharaoh accuses the people of being lazy. Why do they have so much time on their hands to dream about a vacation in the desert to serve their God? So he dispenses the ultimate cure for laziness, crippling, backbreaking work. A little bit later, Foreman says, why even bother with a second speech that seems destined from the get-go to infuriate the Egyptian king? And so that's some of Foreman's conversation there that we find from just some of these weird interactions between Moses and Pharaoh. Now, we just got a couple more questions here, and then we're gonna dive in. Foreman says this. Foreman says, why does God, I'm not reading anymore, but this is one of Foreman's questions. Foreman asks the question, why does God all of a sudden care about his own name, by the way? When you're reading this story, God all of a sudden cares, and it's going to be in the next chapter, Brent, right after chapter 5, chapter 6, God all of a sudden starts to care about his own name. God's never really cared up to this point. Like the people in this story have called God all kinds of things. Like I remember Hagar saying, the God who sees me. I can remember Abraham calling God the God who provides. And God's never shown up and been like, listen, don't give me names. Or he hasn't shown up and be like, no, that's not my name. Here's my name. God's never, in fact, when he was asked his name, Jacob asked his name, maybe, when he was wrestling with the man. Why do you ask my name? Like, God's never seemed to care about. Now, all of a sudden, God cares about his own name. Moses asked him about a name similar to Jacob. And if you're reading the story, you might anticipate God's not going to tell him. But now, all of a sudden, God now has names. And not only this, but a little bit later in the story, there will be that stop in the desert where Moses is going to be with Zipporah. He's going to be on his way back to Egypt. And there's going to be this stop in the desert. And God's going to tell Moses to make sure he remembers the conversation they had about name. Like, God all of a sudden really cares about names. And that's going to be really interesting. And so, Brent, if you wouldn't mind, that's where we're going to start to jump in. And we're going to start to peel some of these layers back and start to answer some of these questions and look at some of these details. So if you would, give us Exodus 6, 2 through 8.
God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians, and I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord.
All right. So God talks to Moses and he says, listen, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all those people, your ancestors, the patriarchs, those people in the past, they knew me as El Shaddai. Now, El Shaddai is a confounding name when we try to translate it. We often translate it in the text as God Almighty. What did your translation, what did the NIV say, Brent, when it said that?
It says God Almighty, and then it has a footnote saying, the Hebrew is El Shaddai, and it doesn't offer any further explanation.
Yeah, and the reason why is because Shaddai really means nothing. Shaddai would be breast, which would be a very common ancient name for God. The goddess of fertility would often be the goddess, the breasted one. That would make sense. Like fertility, breast would make sense, but Shaddai is not technically breast. Shaddai would be. So that doesn't seem to make a whole bunch of sense. Shaddai, there's a whole bunch of other theories about what Shaddai could mean, but it's not that. It's very technically not any of those options. And so the rabbinical conversation played on this. And we touched on this, Brent, all the way back in that same episode 2, when we talked about the God who knows when to say enough. And we didn't offer, that was the very beginning of our journey in Bema. So we didn't offer a whole lot of sourcing, citation, or we get a lot of questions about that. One of my favorite explanations of it is actually in this same book by Rabbi Foreman. Chapter 6, Rabbi Foreman's going to talk about this name Shaddai and what the rabbis said about Shaddai, because the rabbis were confounded too. And they said it must mean something. This name must have some kind of meaning. Here's what Foreman says. He says, we can, however, apply it indirectly, for although Shaddai itself is not a word, the sages of the Midrash, and he gives a source here, Genesis Rabbah 5:8, as well as elsewhere. So there's multiple references, but he's going to reference Genesis Rabbah 5:8. The sages saw the name as a kind of contraction of several words. So they saw El Shaddai as a phrase. As they put it, Shaddai is the name given to Mi She'amar Leolamo Dai, or that Hebrew phrase would mean the one who said to his world, enough. The one who said to his world, enough. The God who knows when to say enough, we said in episode 2. So God now brings this up in Exodus 6. He says, I used to be known as the God who knows when to say enough, according to the rabbis and the sages. Their point is that the God that the patriarchs knew, the God that Moses' ancestors knew, was a God that knew how to practice restraint. It was a God who knew when to pull back, to stop creating, we said, to stop destroying, we said in Genesis. A God of restraint. But now God wants to be known not for what he doesn't do, but for what he does do. And so now God gives himself a different name. And it's a name that is just as confounding. You really can't translate it. We do our best. Yod, He, Vav, He in the Hebrew. We don't really know what to do with the vowelations. People say Jehovah, but that's just a misunderstanding of a manuscript notation where people ended up putting the vowels of Adonai in the midst of the name Yod He Vav He, and they came up with Jehovah. So Jehovah's really not, that's a total misnomer. It's not a biblical name at all. We don't really know how to say, we might say things like Yahweh or Yahweh, people will say. Yod He Vav He. Lots of rabbinic conversation about this name. Very confounding. What does it mean? The focus, as God talks about his name, seems to be on timelessness. We remember the phrase where he gives to Moses, I am that which I will be. I am that I am, or however you want to translate it. Very difficult, really impossible to translate. But the focus seems to be on its timelessness, God's timelessness. Foreman explains it this way in the book. He says, imagine the game of Monopoly. Monopoly, I think it's made by somebody else, but Monopoly used to be made by Parker Brothers. Is that right? Is it made by Parker Brothers today? Who makes Monopoly, Brent?
Maybe Milton Bradley maybe bought it or something.
Yeah,
but
I think that's the case. Yeah.
Something like that. A game that I love, by the way, just throwing that out there.
Who doesn't?
Not necessarily a beloved game by my wife, for one.
Yeah,
would rather die than play that game.
Well, Foreman says Parker Brothers, right? Let's say they make Monopoly. And let's say that you're on the Monopoly board. You're the hat or the race car. I always like to be the race car when I play Monopoly. It's my style. Vroom, vroom. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you're on the board. How do you explain, like you see evidence of Parker. Somebody made the board. You even see Parker's name, Parker Brothers, on the board. Like you know that Parker exists, but how do you explain Parker when you're on the game board? Like you really can't. The only way you could explain him is using language that you can understand from the game board, because you don't know what it's like to exist outside the game board. Does that make sense, Brent?
Right.
Like you can't be the top hat and know what it's like to be anything other than the top hat in the world of Monopoly. Like you don't know what it's like to stand outside the world of Monopoly, to have created. God has this same relationship to his creation, the world that he's created. In a sense, he could say, Moses, you want to know my name, but you can't comprehend me. Like, you don't know what it's like to be me. I'm like Parker Brothers, and you're like a piece on the Monopoly board. I don't mean that in a trivial, demeaning way. I just mean, how do we comprehend somebody who is outside the world that he created? I'm timeless, God might say. I'm outside your understanding. And this is something that Foreman says confronts the differences between polytheism and monotheism. Hang with me, everybody. Foreman said polytheism, if it's polytheism, you are a disconnected observer on the board. You're the top hat, and you're just watching all these different gods kind of interact above the board. But they're doing their thing, and you are disconnected. This is why Pharaoh is concerned, by the way, with precision and not with power. Like Pharaoh expects the gods to do things. That frogs would show up. That darkness could consume the land. That livestock would die. That doesn't seem to concern him, because that's what he would expect. What is something that he wouldn't expect is that Moses or some player on the board could actually, that there would be precision. This is the difference between polytheism and monotheism. It's polytheism. Moses, Pharaoh, the players on the board can't control the precision of the power. They can only experience the power. If it's monotheism, that means that this God is intimately present on the board with you. This God is, in a very real, personal way, in the game, because there is no other God. The God is in relationship with his creation and nothing else. So if there's monotheistic worldview, well, now all of a sudden we have precision at play. This is something Pharaoh is completely unfamiliar with. This is why Moses has two speeches. Moses shows up to Pharaoh and he says, let us go love and worship Yahweh in the desert. Let us go love and worship. And he uses that name, that timeless name. He says, we want to go love Adonai, Yahweh, in the desert. But this is a foreign concept to Pharaoh. His response was, I don't know him. I don't know this. I don't know Adonai. I don't know Yahweh. I don't know who you're talking about. And I don't understand a concept where you would love a God and a God would love you. There are the gods, and they're pretty much angry all the time. They're pretty much grumpy, and we're just on the. I don't even understand what you're talking about, Moses. This is why Moses has speech number 2. Moses essentially meets Pharaoh on his level and says, okay, let me talk about gods the way that you understand them. If we don't go, God's going to be angry and he could crush us. To which Pharaoh kindly denies. And what we then see unfold is what I would like to call God's pursuit of Pharaoh's heart. And this is where the hardening of Pharaoh's heart comes in. What I was never taught, and I am flabbergasted that our typical conversations that I'm very familiar with from my days of Bible college. Between Calvinism and Arminianism, and did God harden his heart? Or did Pharaoh harden his heart? Is it free will? Is it determinism? What nobody ever taught me is that there's two Hebrew words at work in the middle of this story. There are two different hardenings. In your English Bible, almost all of them will simply translate it as hardened. But there's two different words. Does that seem significant to you, Brent?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely it does. And so there are these two words. The first word is kavod. Kavod. Kavod means glory, heavy, weighty, stubborn. I used to think to myself, stupided. I don't know why, but in my brain, it's probably a totally crass word to use. But when Pharaoh's heart is kavoded, it means it's made heavy. It's weighty. It's stubborn. He can't see it. Whether he's not letting himself see it or whether God's not letting him see it, he's stupided. Like he can't see it. He can't see it. Then there's the word hazak. Hazak is the Hebrew word for to be strong. Hazak v'hamatz, be strong and courageous. We will hear later in the story. Hazak, strengthened. It's a word of resolve. So hazak is when I do see it and I choose to power through. Kavod is when I don't see it. I just don't see it. It's right there in front of me, but I don't see it for what it is. My heart is kavoded. It's heavied. It's hardened. But then I can actually see it. I can see it for what it is, and I can hazak my heart. I can strengthen my heart. Now, you can actually go through all of the different references to the plagues. And you can actually go through, and some of them are kind of hard to tell. Who's doing the hardening? But you can do a word study and figure out which word it is.
Yeah, I'll put links to these two words from Blue Letter Bible in so you can just click on it and then see all the references where each of them show up.
Oh, yeah. Perfect. Absolutely. Yep. So we can go through the Nile turns to blood and Pharaoh's heart is hazaked. Now, we're not told by who. I tend to assume it's God doing it. Maybe you read Pharaoh there. I don't know. Then you have the plague of the frogs. And Pharaoh's very interested in the precision. I don't want them gone right now. I want them gone. You can make them go tomorrow? Make them go tomorrow. Like you would think you would want them gone right now. But Pharaoh's like, how about tomorrow? Sure. And they go tomorrow. And Pharaoh's heart is kavoded. And Pharaoh kavodes his heart. So Pharaoh can't see it. Right? And so you can do this whole, there are these moments where Pharaoh actually sees it, but God hazaks his heart, which is crazy. Because you're like, wait a minute. So Pharaoh sees, but God's like, yeah, he sees, but he's not where I want him yet. He's not yet grappling with what I want him to grapple with. And so God hazaks his heart. Even though he can see, God strengthens it. He gives him resolve. There are these moments in the Exodus story where Pharaoh's like, okay, Moses, you win. Go ahead. Go out to the desert, take your people and go. And then all of a sudden it will say, and God hardened his heart. Because he's not just, here's the thing that floored me when I learned this, Brent. God's not just trying to get his people rescued. He's also trying to get Pharaoh rescued. Like God's not just trying, why 10 plagues? Because God's not just trying to rescue his people. If he was just trying to rescue his people, he'd probably do it in one plague. Boom, done. They're out, gone. But God's not just trying to rescue his people. He's also trying to rescue Pharaoh. Pharaoh, I want to know, are you going to bow the knee? Because I would love, Pharaoh, to have you come on my team. I would love to have you surrender and find salvation and liberation. God's pursuing Pharaoh. And until Pharaoh's at that point, God's not going to let him make a move. And so God hazaks his heart. There comes a point where Pharaoh finally gets it. It comes with the plague of hail, if I remember correctly. And Foreman will do all this in his book. So I'm not giving you all the details because I want you to be able to go get the book and enjoy it. But Pharaoh will get to a place where he sees, I believe, the hail, and all of a sudden he gets it. He sees it, and for the first time in the story, Pharaoh will hazak his own heart. So Pharaoh will see it, he will get it, and he will choose to have resolve and to say, I'm not going to bow the knee. And at that point, God is going to take over and say, okay, if that's what we're doing, well, then now the rest of the story is about me talking to my people. I wanted you, Pharaoh, but if you're going to tell me no, then I'm going to make sure that the Egyptians and the Israelites see what I want them to see, and we're going to move on to the rest of the story. And that was like this mind-blowing goodness to see why is God taking all this time? Why is it I thought that Pharaoh was the end? This is God's relentless pursuit. This is how much God loves even our enemies. Like, this is how much God loves. Like, he's going to pursue Pharaoh, and he's going to make sure that Pharaoh's at the point he needs him to be to make the decision he needs him to make. And then he's going to let Pharaoh make the decision, and he respects that decision, and he moves on with the story. So then Foreman says, okay, so we've seen God pursuing Pharaoh. Why the emphasis on the firstborn? Why the emphasis? Why all this presence of the firstborn? Why is this whole story the Passover? Why is it the story of the firstborn? Why are all these mentions of the firstborn? God is asking his people to be the Behor. God is asking his people to be the firstborn.
Now, Marty, we've talked about Behor a little bit before, but maybe a reminder would be in order on what exactly that means and what the role is and how that would play out for them.
Absolutely. Tell me what you remember, Brent, about the Behor. What is the Behor? What does that mean? What's some of the relevant stuff we can remember here?
Well, I think, in the sense of like an inheritance, they get the double portion, but they also have extra responsibility. But I also don't necessarily know what that would mean for God's whole people to be a Behor versus like what that would mean within a family.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right on track. There is this double portion of inheritance, which is what everybody often thinks of when they think of the firstborn. But what we've tried to really focus on throughout our journey here of session 1 and the last handful of episodes is the Behor has a double portion of responsibility. The Behor has this calling to carry on the legacy, to follow in the footsteps of their dad, to spread dad's values to the rest of the kids. So in this sense, if God's asking a nation of people to be his Behor, he's coming to them, he's rescuing them out of Egypt. He's going to lead them, we're skipping ahead in the story, he's going to lead them, spoiler alert, out of Egypt through the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. God's wanting to start a new chapter of the story. God's found a partner. He found a partner in Abraham. But now he's found a partner in an entire, you said it, I don't know what it means in terms of a nation. Now God's found a national partner, like an entire community of people, an entire family, an entire nation of people that could be, he's going to say later, a kingdom of priests who can be a Behor. Israel becomes the Behor of God, the firstborn of God. What does that even mean? It sounds like poetic language. It means that God's looking for somebody who will take his values and give them to the rest of the world. In a lot of ways, it's like what God asked Moses to do. God said, Moses, I need you to be, I don't need you to go give a message to Pharaoh. I need you to go be the message to Pharaoh. God's now asking an entire group of people, I don't need you to have a message to give to the world. I need you to go be the message to the rest of the world. I'm asking you to be, as a nation, my Behor. And the Jews talked about this in the rabbinical commentary to great end. There is a conversation about what it means to be born again. I know Christians like to think that the idea of being born again is that's like a very Christian phrase. And Judaism in our modern era shies away from it because of its Christian overtones. But rabbinically, centuries ago, the term being born again, we're being born a second time, this time as God's Behor. We weren't God's Behor originally, but now we're being born again as God's Behor, a partner to what God is doing in the world. Akiva made, I'm almost positive it's Akiva. I have not been able to hunt this down, Brent. If anybody can hunt this down, they need to let me know where it comes from. Somewhere, I thought it was Foreman that I learned it from, but I can't find it with Foreman's material either. But somewhere I was told it was Akiva that made an observation that in the Passover, the people of God left through a bloody door. They took the Passover blood of the lamb and they put it on what, Brent?
On the doorposts.
On the doorposts.
Like
they put it
the top and the sides.
Yeah, the top and the sides. And I've been told that there was a rabbi. I thought it was Akiva, but I can't find it. That there was a rabbi, Akiva maybe, who said that the lintel didn't just refer to the top of the doorpost, but it also referred to the threshold of the doorpost. And I don't think he meant that literally, whatever rabbi taught that. I think that rabbi meant it with a twinkle in his eye because he wanted the readers and the students to see a birth image. They were leaving in haste, in hurry, through a bloody door. The rabbis often have talked about the Red Sea as a birth canal. They leave Egypt and they are being born again. We'll end up talking later in season 6. Brent will end up going through the Gospel of John verse by verse. And there will be an episode where we'll talk about Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus and this invitation to be born again. And he uses Exodus language, water and spirit. What is the Red Sea? What blows over the Red Sea to open up that birth canal? The spirit, the ruach. Water and spirit is Exodus language. And so there's this whole idea of being born again. This is what we're reading in the Exodus story. Not just a record of what happened in history, but we're seeing a pursuit of God as he pursues Pharaoh, because he doesn't just want his people out of Egypt. He also wants to rescue Pharaoh because he cares as much about Pharaoh and his heart as he does anybody else's heart. And he's also rescuing his people into a partnership where he's asking them to be a firstborn so they can partner with him to spread his values to the rest of the world. And before we wrap up, I will just make the point that a few of the questions that remain unanswered in today's lesson, part 4 of Foreman's book, the one we're talking about here, the Exodus you almost passed over, that part alone was worth the entire price of this book. He will talk about why Moses may have anticipated that Pharaoh would in fact change his heart. Like there's actually biblical reason to assume that might happen. And part 4 of that book is my favorite part of the entire book. And I didn't even talk about it today because people ought to buy the book for themselves and have their own copy on their shelf.
Well, I had a question that I was noticing, and maybe you can tell me if that is answered in the book. This chapter 5 stuff that we were reading, and going back and forth with the names, it seems like maybe Moses is trying to do that too. And maybe these are God's words through Moses. I'm not entirely clear. But it starts off, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says," blah, blah, blah. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord? I don't know him." And then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us," blah, 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 "the Lord our God." And then it says after that, we didn't read this part. It says, "But the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you doing this?" And then end quotation marks. And then it says, "Then Pharaoh said." So there's going back and forth on the names for both sides. And it almost seems like if this is Moses doing this, Moses is like, okay, how can I get him to understand who God is? Because if he can just understand it, then maybe he'll actually let us go.
Yes. And I do think that's in that chapter there with Foreman. I think he does a really good job pulling those details apart because Moses is dancing with those names. Whenever it says the Lord in your English translation, that's the word Adonai. It's going to be the capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That's that holy Yod-He, Vav-He name of God. That's the one that Pharaoh doesn't recognize. But then Moses will use the word God, which is Elohim. And Elohim would be the generic word that Pharaoh knows, the gods. In fact, Elohim even has a plural feel to it. So it just can mean, sometimes it's Ha Elohim, as in the gods. And absolutely, Moses is going, the God that we know. And Pharaoh's like, I don't know him. And he's like, okay, just God. You know God. Yeah, okay. The God we know, the God of the Hebrews, God. And he's going back and forth between the intimate name that they understand and the God that they know versus the concepts of God that Pharaoh has. And I do think there's absolutely a dance there that Foreman's suggesting Moses is engaging in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, like we said, many questions remain, as is the case with most episodes. But I think that'll do it for today, Marty.
Absolutely. It's another great conversation where we see the heart of God, not just for his people, but with all those outside of his people. And this isn't just a crazy story of God wheeling and dealing plagues and judgment, but a God really pursuing, really chasing down, really to the nth degree. I want all of you. I want all of you to say yes to my love and my grace and what I'm doing in the world. If you're not going to, well, we're going to pursue justice here. And we're going to run this out to Shalom's end. But I think we see that really well here in this story in ways that I never appreciated when I was arguing about, well, was it God or was it Pharaoh that hardened his heart? All of that conversation was void of a God really pursuing Pharaoh's heart.
Beautiful. Well, you can find more details about the show at BehemothDiscipleship.com. The show notes are there as well as in your podcast app. If anybody does find a reference to Akiva or whatever rabbi it may have been who was talking about that idea, definitely let us know. I can add that to the show notes later on. But you can use the website to get in touch with us. The contact page will always give you the most up-to-date way to do that. You can find a group with our map. You can start your own group. You can support our work. Everything that we do is made possible by listeners like you who support us. So thank you for those of you who do that. And if you want to start, you can find those details on the website. So everything is there. But thanks for joining us on the Behemoth Podcast. This week, we'll talk to you again soon.
Hi, I'm Katie, a Behemoth listener in Tucson, Arizona, and here is the prayer from episode 19's companion. To the God who sees me and calls me very good, the God who provides, to the God who knows when to stop creating, stop destroying, knowing when to say enough, to the God who hears our cries and acts, thank you for your breath and life and hope and trust in us. May we embrace our share of your inheritance, the call to be your message to the world. Strengthen our hearts, fill our minds and bodies and souls, that we may recognize you and your voice always. In the name of the God who was and forever is. Amen.